The Hybrid, Part 2, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus, read by the author. Be sure to go listen to Part 1 first. You can find it linked in the description down below. That day, Dylan was ordered to patrol the tunnels at night, instead of doing it during the day. Normally his patrol went from either in the morning or the afternoon, but his orders that day were 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Once his shift started, he followed the familiar path to Shadow's cell, and when he got there, he called out to the hybrid. "Sorry, I was told to come here later than usual," Dylan said, entering the cell. "That's okay. I knew you'd come back," Shadow replied. He was lying in the darkest part of his cell again, invisible except for his glowing green eyes. "You look creepy there, just sitting in the darkness," Dylan said, stopping in the middle of the cage. Shadow stood and silently came over so he could be seen in the light that came in through the bars. They sat down, and Shadow asked Dylan something he'd been thinking about. "Why did you want to help me?" "Because you don't deserve this. You're trapped, mistreated, hurt, and experimented on. The people who made you think they can do that because they think of you as a number, an object, and well, you're the only one in the whole city I'd call a friend. That tells you how much of a social butterfly I am," Dylan said, chuckling softly. Shadow pressed the side of his head against Dylan. "Thank you. That means a lot," he whispered, nuzzling his friend gently. Dylan smiled at the affection and leaned against Shadow's shoulder, stroking the dinosaur's head along the side of the crests. They sat together like that for a while, until Dylan broke the silence with a sigh. "Shadow, I feel terrible that I can't help you. I've tried to think of something, but I got nowhere. And since I don't know why you were made, I don't want to risk telling anyone. I don't know who allowed you to be, and I don't know what their motives for it are. I've tried to figure it out, but I can't go ask people about it. I'm sorry. I guess I'm just too stupid to help you get out of here." Shadow stood up like he'd been hit when Dylan said that, causing Dylan to fall to the floor. Shadow stood over him, and he sank down and stood on all fours, creeping towards Dylan with obvious, serious purpose. Shadow?" Dylan said, scooting back a little. Shadow slowly crept closer until Dylan was backed into a corner. He pressed his snout against Dylan's face, and then spoke softly. "I want you to hear this. I want to make sure you actually listen. Don't blame yourself. This is not your fault," Shadow said. "I know you can't help me. Hearing you blame yourself for my problems just hurts more. So please don't." Several floors up in the labs, Ian was having a heated conversation. "We'll need more samples," Ian reported, closing the door to the lab's DNA storage room. "Why?" "We don't have enough DNA in storage, namely raptor DNA. We've used more of it than has been logged, it seems. Tim, you'll be in charge of the labs. I'll go set some traps. Hopefully we'll get lucky, and I'll return with fresh samples," Ian said. "There's a lot of raptors out there, and their genes are close enough that I can work with any species I catch. Maybe we should just let this project go. The amount of resources it would take to create the dinosaur you envision," Tim said, but he was cut off. "Is it April 1st? I didn't realize," Ian said, the sarcasm very evident in his voice. "For a brilliant man, you're acting like the king's jester." After he left, Tim went to his office. It was small, but he had access to the cameras and looked. Sure enough, the trooper was again visiting the hybrid. He had watched their interactions on a few occasions, fascinated. The interactions proved his proposed approaches had been the correct ones over trying to force it to submit through breaking its will to resist. He was happy the hybrid had formed a bond with someone. He'd never been one to abuse the animal, and after the recent shift in Ian's aura, he hadn't reported the interactions either. He wouldn't tell anyone. No one should know. Especially with Tim suspecting Ian's motives were far more ambitious and evil than he had let on. After listening in on part of Ian's meeting with Miller, Tim realized something was going on he was unaware of. He decided to begin playing a game of double agent, and if it got as bad as he feared it would, he'd spill every bean to the Patriots as a whole. He just had to uncover the conspiracy first, whatever it might have been. The first thing he did as an unofficial double agent was disable access to the security camera pointed at 00001's cage to all computers but his own, doing it in a manner that made it seem like the camera had finally just failed like so many others in the tunnels had. No one would be able to watch the hybrid now unless they were right outside its cage. With a smile, he left the room and went back to the lab. If he was going to make Ian think he was still blissfully unaware, then he'd still have to continue to work on developing version 2 for the time being. Miller was a very well-off individual, and someone as high in the ranks of the extremists as the likes of Ian. He was a wild card, and looked like what a young CEO of some corporation would have looked like before the apocalypse. He looked like he could sell you anything. He had neat, clipped hair, and a freshly shaven face, and an upbeat smile. There was also something shifty among the nice hair and clean clothes that put Dylan off when they ran into each other, as Dylan was leaving the tunnels that morning. He'd sat with Shadow all night as usual. Dylan and Miller's meeting had come about because of an old pipe in the ceiling that had finally lost the battle against wear and tear. "Looks like you've been involuntarily showered," Miller said once he and Dylan had closed the valve connecting to it, stopping the shower of water that had been raining down on Dylan for several seconds. "They break all the time. Going on 30-ish years without maintenance will do that," the man had added. "Name's Miller. You're the new guy who patrols the tunnels, making sure people aren't snooping where they shouldn't be, yes?" It had taken Dylan a moment to really take in Miller's appearance. He was just so out of place in such a dingy area as the tunnels. More so by the fact no one else was supposed to be down there other than himself. His presence had put Dylan on guard. It felt like Miller was about to make an offer to him. Dylan's suspicions proved right, and they then turned into rage once Miller had not only revealed he knew about Shadow's existence, but he was one of the ones who Shadow had mentioned torturing him in the past. In fact, he was one of the most prolific. What Dylan didn't know was that Miller was putting him to a test. If he had known, he might have played along. "I don't think any animal should be treated like that," Dylan had said. "That's not an animal. It's a weapon, which is an object for use. How it's treated doesn't matter," Miller had replied, holding out his hand for Dylan to shake. Dylan didn't. Instead, he just walked past Miller and walked the corridors until his shift was over, telling him as he passed him, "Actually, it does. If you don't keep your weapon in good shape, then it might just screw you over." Miller had watched him walk away. Then he pulled out a walkie-talkie from his pocket. "Let's get him out of here and get someone else down here. He's not a right fit for our cause. Didn't even seem to want to know what the hybrid was doing down here," he said with a growl. He lifted the set to his ear and listened to a reply, and then said into it, "You can't do it until the night after tomorrow?" he asked and lifted it to his ear again. Miller sighed. "Fine." "Reassigned?" Dylan asked after the day's briefing had concluded. "Yes. Guard duty on the wall for the time being, starting tomorrow night. You'll do your old assignment for one last time tonight, because we couldn't remove your replacements from their old jobs until then. Understood, Fizpatrick?" the colonel firmly replied, handing Dylan a written copy of the order. "Yes, sir, Colonel," Dylan quietly said. Dylan traveled down the subterranean tunnels for the last time. He would not be allowed down there after his reassignment went into effect. He wouldn't miss the tunnels, the dim lights, or the mold. He would miss Shadow. Dylan had spent the whole day trying to think of a way to get Shadow out, but he couldn't come up with anything practical for slipping the dinosaur out of the city. Even though he did have a few ideas for getting Shadow above ground, he couldn't think of how to get him out of that cell. Shadow would not fit through the iron door, and Dylan didn't know how the bars opened. He knew there had to be a way, since Shadow mentioned a few occasions he remembered being tranquilized, muzzled, restrained, and wheeled into a laboratory upstairs. He walked down the tunnels, the only person inside them on that night, and he looked into the empty cages as he passed them. He imagined what horrors might have been inside if the United Communities had not won the war. Each cage would have either contained captured talking dinosaurs or more hybrids, each deadlier than the one that preceded them. Thankfully, that reality had never come to pass. Ended like dreams, or nightmares rather, when you wake up, because that army had never been a reality. He approached the only cage with an occupant, hopefully the only one that would ever have an occupant, and stopped. He had no idea what he was going to say to Shadow. He couldn't just not say anything, but he didn't have any idea how to break the news to him. He took a breath and walked the rest of the way, passing into view of the cell's occupant. Shadow sat up at the sight of his human friend. He was always just as excited to see Dylan. Still, it only took a moment for Shadow to sense that something was wrong with Dylan. Those glowing green eyes never missed anything. "What is it?" he asked after Dylan entered his cell. "Nothing good," Dylan replied. "What?" Shadow asked, nervous now. "I've been reassigned. I can't come down here any more after tonight," Dylan answered with a sigh. Shadow stared, not moving, at Dylan. "What?" he asked softly. I can't come back. But, Shadow, I can't come back. I would if I could, but he was cut off as Shadow leapt off the ground and forcefully tackled him to the cell floor. Even with his head spinning, Dylan could tell Shadow wasn't playing, but was instead in a fit of blind fury. "You tease," Shadow managed to hiss. The wave of emotions at Dylan's news and his constantly bottled up rage at his creators clearly not letting him see things straight in that moment. Dylan only realized at that moment that his news was the perfect storm to set that rage off. "That's all you've been doing? Winding me up? You think it's funny to shatter the only good thing in my life?" Shadow snarled, and raised his claws in a threatening pose, but at the last second he slammed them into the concrete next to Dylan's head, cracking the cell floor. It all happened so fast that Dylan didn't have a chance to speak through the duration of the event. Shaking from rage, the hybrid climbed off Dylan, who was also shaking but too stunned to move. "Leave," Shadow hissed, turning and slinking into the darkest part of his cell, shaking himself, though from the fact that the only good thing in his life had been ripped away from him. It was so unfair, and he didn't know if he could keep his emotions in check for much longer. Dylan sat up after Shadow had settled back down. "Shadow, it wasn't my idea. I would never have built up a friendship with you just to tear it away for a laugh. And I know what happened just now wasn't you. You have so much built-up rage inside of you that the slightest thing can set it off. I know. I should have thought a better way to deliver the news to you. If you really did believe that I was just building this up to break your heart in two, then you wouldn't have intentionally missed my skull with those claws." Dylan slowly stood up and walked toward Shadow. "I don't want to leave. I really don't." And to prove it to you, he stopped in the center of the cell, arms out at his sides. "If I were building you up, I wouldn't do this. If you want to do anything, come at me. Take it out on me. I won't stop you." Shadow slowly lifted his head and stood, walking over to Dylan on all fours. I'd never hurt you. I don't know what happened to me there," Shadow softly said. nuzzling Dylan's head with his nose. He sounded scared of himself in that moment. Dylan reached the hand up and stroked Shadow's bottom jaw. I know. You just saw red for a second. It happens to everyone. You have so much pent-up rage inside of you that it just exploded. That wasn't you. It's them. I don't think I can do it. Being alone anymore, Shadow whimpered. Please don't leave, he begged. Dylan hugged Shadow's neck, saying, I'm sorry, but they won't even allow me down here again after tonight. You shouldn't have to be either, but we've been dealt losing hands, it seems. Let's just make the best of this last time we can see each other. Shadow tightened his grip on his friend. Dylan was the only good thing that Shadow had known in his life for years, and at that moment, he never wanted to let him go. Several days later, Dylan was standing watch on the city's fortified wall as night fell, and the city was cast into darkness, the only lights being the occasional fire pit that was ablaze, used to help illuminate the streets at night. In Dylan's opinion, guard duty was actually the worst job there could possibly be. Watch the forest for a few hours, maybe point a gun at something that turned out to just be a squirrel. That was his job. Very useful. As he stared off into the darkness, his mind began wandering and it quickly went back to Shadow. Dylan missed him and wished there was something he could do to get him out. But even if there was, the second he went near that place again, he'd probably get arrested for not being at his post. When his replacement arrived, Dylan was very happy to get off the wall and go home and get some sleep. Shadow also thought about Dylan as the hours slowly passed for him. His first friend was now gone, and he'd probably never see him again. The days since Dylan had been reassigned had been some of the worst for Shadow. He'd gotten a taste of friendship, and now it was gone. At least before he'd met Dylan, he didn't know what he was missing out on. Not knowing was bliss compared to what he felt now. He'd been trying to sleep when the familiar pain of electrocution shot through his body again, zapping him from the concealed wiring within the cell floor. Once it passed, Shadow opened his eyes, looked up, and snarled. There was Miller, standing outside of the cell bars, smirk on his face, and remote in hand. Wake up, version 1. No sleep for you tonight, Miller said. His remote connected to an electrical system that ran down under the cell floor and could be used to shock anyone or anything in the cell at any time. He hit the button again, sending another wave of electricity into Shadow. Not lethal, but it hurt. It hurt a lot. After 5 minutes of it going back and forth in this way, Shadow finally reached his limit and roared, shrieking like a deranged animal, and flung himself at Miller with jaws agape, wanting nothing more than to rip him into 100 pieces with his claws. Flying out of the dark section of his cell, shrieking, he collided with the bars and stuck his arms through them, clawing at the man who was just out of reach. Miller took a step back. Oh, you're scary, he chuckled, the sarcasm radiating off him only topped by his smugness. He hit the button again. Shadow snarled, taking a step back. Every time he planted a foot, pain surged through the leg. Shaking his anger, his pure fury grew to unprecedented levels. With every electric jolt of pain it grew, and eventually he could not hold it back any longer. Shadow had seen red before, 1,000 times. But what he saw in that moment was not red. It was something fiery and volatile. It gave him a surge unlike any he had before. And even though he had done it 1,000 times before, Shadow again threw himself at the bars, flying into them with full force and pressing his entire body weight against them as he rammed into them. Whether it was some kind of divine intervention, his rage adding that extra amount of power to the strike, or just the structure finally giving out from lack of maintenance, Shadow suddenly felt himself fall forward. When he opened his eyes, he was on the ground, in the corridor outside of his cell. The bars had fallen under his weight. "Oh shit," Miller said after it sunk in what had happened. He dropped the remote and sprinted down a tunnel as Shadow just lay where he was, stunned. It not having fully hit him yet that he was free of his cell and he had a chance to escape. Slowly, he climbed onto his feet, looking down the tunnels in both directions, and then back into his cell once again. Distant shouting made him react, and, after glancing around again, feeling a fresh wave of strength, Shadow took off and turned down a pitch-dark, narrow side passage, not making a sound, and vanishing, leaving the empty cell behind. Dylan's living area was nothing special. A tiny room. Crammed inside were cabinets, a sink and toilet, a bed, and a counter with a broken, sad-looking coffee maker on it that had been sitting there for at least a decade. Probably 2. He flopped down onto his bed and just looked up at the dirty ceiling. The sudden sound of alarms coming from down the road, audible through his open window, made him sit back up. He went out into his small balcony and realized it was coming from the labs. Something or someone had triggered the alarms inside the building. Knowing the cat would be out of the bag before morning, Miller decided to sound a warning to the people in the labs above, and the others scattered around who would know what it meant. It was time to begin plans to clear out, or make up a damn good cover story. With any luck, things could still go as planned, but version 2 hadn't fully developed yet. The synthetic bag his embryo was rapidly developing and would need to stay in place for at least another full day, maybe 2 before he'd hatch. Preemptive or not, we gotta do it now, Miller said to himself. After pulling the old fire alarm, Miller continued running down the tunnels. The yellow lights above, rusted, leaking pipes on the ceiling, and occasional panels of switches and fuses bolted to the walls were his only companions. His destination was the nearest staircase that led up into the labs, where he could help with the evacuation preparations. That way, when version 2 hatched, they could leave right away. If they'd developed version 2 with a real egg, like version 3, they could have left that night. But the scientists had insisted on a synthetic one that would develop the embryo to maturity much faster. Unfortunately, it couldn't be moved. "Stop!" a voice shouted. Miller paused and turned, seeing 2 recruits running up behind him, Dylan's replacements. They stopped about 20 feet from him while he stood in a 4-way, pitch-dark tunnels on each side. Thankfully, there was no sign of glowing eyes. He had no idea where the hybrid was, but he didn't think it was close. "Why did you pull the alarm?" one of the recruits asked. "And what the hell are you doing down here? No one is supposed to be on this floor but us," the second added. Miller paused for a moment, thinking if he should lie or not. "Talk!" one of the soldiers shouted, raising his gun. Miller snapped as soon as he heard their tone and saw the soldier's action. "It's loose! You can't tell me you didn't see it on your past patrols!" Miller shouted. "We didn't see anything. What's loose?" one of the young soldiers replied. "Oh, I guess it must have hit itself. But surely the colonel told you what you were doing down here when he assigned you to this post, right? He's in on it! Surely he must have at least given you a hint! That young recruit from before didn't turn out to be right, so we had him replaced with you 2! Seeing if you'd be more in tune to what we're doing in these labs. More curious. More inclined to ask questions and learn the truth. But if you never even saw the seed waiting down here to spark those questions, then it was all a waste of time." The first of the recruits also now raised his gun. "See if we'd be into what? Learn what truth? What did you see down here?" Miller scoffed and spread his arms wide in dramatic fashion. "The future! The plan to take back what's ours! We have built the first true weapon of the new world. It's art. A dinosaur we created, built to be a weapon, and it got loose. But we'll make more. We have made more, and we few, the true patriots, will restore everything back to how it should be." "Our days of being covert are just about over," Miller explained. At that moment, a black shape shot out of the tunnel to the left and carried Miller off in its jaws. It was gone less than a second after it had appeared, vanishing into the opposite tunnel it had emerged from. The two recruits didn't get a good look. They only saw a black blur. They just stared wide-eyed at the spot for a few seconds, rooted in their places. "Go, go, 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 run!" the first one who had raised his gun said. They turned and ran, hoping the monster would stay in the darkness and not follow them. All they heard behind them was Miller screaming. Shadow enjoyed every single second of it, letting the man in the suit feel his pain. He slowly cut into him with his claws. He stabbed Miller's legs with his raptor sickle claws. He snapped bones with powerful bites. He didn't touch Miller's eyes, though. He wanted his tormentor to see everything that was going to happen to him. And Shadow also wanted his glowing eyes to be the last sight Miller ever saw. In the dark tunnel, Shadow's revenge went on for almost 30 full minutes, and he made sure Miller was alive for all of it. When he was satisfied, Shadow cut the man's belly open and pulled Miller's intestines out, and then he left him there, choking to die alone in the darkness. With his revenge completed, Shadow now could focus on finding a way out. Keeping quiet, he went from hall to hall. He didn't see any other people, but he knew the two he had glimpsed while carrying Miller off would have reported him by now. What their response would be, he didn't know, but he didn't want to be around in case a bunch of people came hunting for him. Finally, he did find a way out. A staircase. The stairs went up, and Shadow broke through the door at the top, exiting a side door set into a brick building, and walked out onto the street. He stood under a security light for the building and just gazed around. It was night out, and there was fresh air. Shadow had never smelled it before. It was clean, and it wasn't damp, unlike the stagnant air in the tunnels. Fresh, cool night air was the most wonderful thing he had ever smelled, and Shadow took several deep breaths of it. He was outside, and it didn't seem real. Shadow remained frozen to his spot and just looked around with jaws slightly parted in astonishment, his gaze reflecting one of awe and childlike wonder. He had never seen the outside, nor had he ever seen anything so big, so expansive. He spent more time than he realized just looking at the buildings and the sky. It wasn't until he heard shouting in the distance from another street that he came back to the moment and knew he needed to move. He was not interested in having to fight his way out of the city, so, still being quiet, Shadow sprinted across the street, climbed the nearest border wall to the outside, threw himself over, and was gone, vanishing like a ghost into the forest. It seems this terrorist group, the True Patriots, made more progress than we thought. They're clearly not just a group of extreme idealists or ambitious scientists as we believed. We don't know who all is in this group either, other than the colonel, who has been apprehended, or how big of a threat they truly are. But we know no one in this room is one of them, hence why you were all called here. We believe there are too few to be a true threat to us or the united communities. That might change yet as more intelligence is gathered. Now, an hour ago, the thing they made escaped over the wall. It is a hybrid dinosaur, made to be a weapon. Two of our own only got a glimpse of it. They claim to not have seen it prior. You all have to go find and kill it before it kills anyone else. Any questions? A commanding member of the Patriots military said to a group he had gathered for a briefing on the situation. Sir, why can't we just let it go? Because, Fizpatrick, the ecosystem out there has been unstable and near the point of collapse for decades. Jurassic-era life doesn't exactly mix with modern-day life very well. It's only now just settling again into a stable situation. A new wrench in the system could be what makes it all collapse. And if the ecosystem goes, then so do we. The hunting party was each given an automatic rifle with a flashlight taped to the barrel. There were 20 people preparing to go to the woods to find the hybrid. "Good hunting," their commander said once they were ready. He escorted them to the gate and saw them off himself. The pitch-dark forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals. What sounded like a flock of pteranodons screeched and squawked in the dark sky overhead, heading towards the river to most likely hunt fish. It was probably the same group that was responsible for an incident a few years back, when a group of 4 people in a rowboat on a river got swarmed by a flock of 2 curious pteranodons. They had only left when one of the 4 hit one of them with one of the oars, though they had fallen into water in the process. Thankfully, no one was hurt in that incident. The only lights in the forest were the flashlights at the end of each gun held by members of the hunting party. They marched in single file line through the trees and brush, weapons up, scanning the forest for any sign of their target. At the very back of the group, Dylan only had his gun reluctantly half raised. They were heading towards a nearby swamp, intending to search it for the hybrid before a wider search began. It was believed the hybrid would go there first due to the large amount of food available and the easy access to water. The troopers in the party had been told to never be without more than one person, and if separated, try to stay in twos. All of a sudden, the nighttime sounds stopped, leaving a silent forest behind. A dangerous forest. The lead soldier, the only one wearing a strapped-on patrol cap, raised his fist, a silent order to stop. Everyone behind him took combat-ready positions, some standing and others crouched. Except Dylan, who had actually let himself fall behind about 5 paces from the group. The lead soldier kept scanning the area with his flashlight, when, from the bushes behind him, out swung a large tail with spikes on the end. The Thagamizers impaled him from behind and went clean through his midsection. He dropped his gun in shock, gasping, and was then flung into one of the other soldiers when the tail swung back around. Screams began to break out, and the soldiers in the group began firing at random shadows. As some tried to reorganize, they began to be picked off one by one, some seized in powerful jaws and carried away, and others dragged screaming into the bushes. Others were slashed by sharp claws and gouged deeply, and others were bit nearly in half. Dylan saw a bush next to one of the soldiers erupt outward, and a black shape shot out and carried him off, visible in the rapidly moving beams from the flashlight for less than a second, as only a blurry dinosaur shape with 2 seemingly floating glowing orbs in its skull and a long, spiked tail. "What the hell is that thing?" someone shouted, firing their gun in the direction the shape had vanished, only to be tripped by the tail and then drug off into the bush. His screams were cut off quickly, their silence accompanied by a simultaneous snap of bone. The shape passed through the panicked soldiers again, carrying off another Patriot soldier and disemboweling the stomach of another with a passing swipe from his clawed fingers. By now, the soldiers were firing in all directions, and no one even came close to hitting the hybrid, and they only became more panicked. As Shadow began to smash the lights on the dropped weapons, one soldier saw a 3-toed foot with the claws of a large raptor slam down on and crush the flashlight taped to a dropped gun, only to look up in time and see the open jaws lunging at his face. When the slaughter had started, Dylan backed up, and as it continued, he ducked back behind a tree, leaving his gun behind, and just waited for it to be over. Dylan slowly sank onto the ground, facing away from the unfolding carnage. Soon, the screams and gunshots stopped. The most the hunters had seen was a quick glimpse of the dinosaur, usually right before they were killed by it. There was just one hunter left now, spinning around in a panic, his gun raised and shaking. From out of the night, a black shape with giant claws and teeth charged him, jaws open, claws extended, and the hunter's terrified scream cut off quickly as the sound of bones being crunched between teeth filled the air. The last light, the one on the hunter's gun, was then smashed out with a powerful stomp from Shadow's foot. The forest was now left in darkness and silence again. Almost silence. Dylan could hear the sound of sniffing approaching him and blurted out, "Shadow, it's me." Silence again. Then, a few seconds later, a dark shape, darker than the forest, moved around the tree. A dark mass with two glowing green eyes. Shadow? Dylan said. Shadow said nothing. He just stood there for a few seconds, totally still. Dylan gazed up at him, unaware if Shadow was going to kill him too for being associated with the hunters. He didn't think Shadow would, but he also knew how unpredictable Shadow could be in moments of blind rage. Dylan then felt two powerful hands adorned with clawed fingers seize him and lift him off the ground and up to eye level with the dinosaur. Shadow cocked his head to the side a bit, his glowing eyes unblinking as he examined who he had picked up. After a few tense seconds, Shadow snorted and licked his lips. "No, I could eat you right up and no one would ever know," he said. Then he relaxed, huffing in an amused way, and Dylan could almost see the amused smirk on the dinosaur's face. "But why would I do that? Instead, I think I'm just going to give you a big hug," he said, and did just that, pulling Dylan tightly against his chest and hugging him tight. Dylan sighed in relief and returned the hug, feeling himself beginning to laugh softly as he did. Shadow sat down on the forest floor and released his friend. "You're free," Dylan said, scooting back and sitting down, his eyes adjusting enough that he could now make out Shadow's shape. Shadow reached a hand outward and gently ran a claw down the side of Dylan's face, as if he still didn't fully believe he was really there. "I missed you." "I missed you too," Dylan replied. He reached out and ran a hand down Shadow's armored nose, a feeling he hadn't realized how much he'd truly missed. Despite what Shadow had just done, Dylan found that he wasn't afraid of him at all. "What are you going to do?" Shadow said after a few minutes. "Go back?" "No. I'm officially defecting. I say we go to one of the United Communities. They take in talking dinosaurs if they're with people. We'd be together and far from the Patriots." "I'd like that," Shadow said. They hugged one another again, and Shadow looked up at the sky. "I never knew what the outside was, what the air was like, and how it feels on your skin. How the leaves and bark of the trees feel under your hands, or the soft ground and how it feels under your toes. I love it," Shadow said, smiling at the sky. He eventually looked down and then added, "Let's go. I want to get far away from here. The nearest community is about a day straight that way," Dylan said, pointing. "Can we wait till morning? I'm exhausted." "I'm wide awake. I'll take us. You can rest," Shadow replied. "How?" Dylan asked. Shadow huffed and motioned to his back. There was enough room between his neck and sail for Dylan to sit. Dylan shrugged. "That'll work, I suppose." Shadow lowered onto all fours and Dylan climbed up. "Hold tight. I'm going to go at a full sprint," Shadow warned. "Okay," Dylan replied. "And Shadow, thanks for not eating me that day we met." "Hey, what kind of friend would I be if I ate you?" Shadow replied with a laugh. "Though I thought it was what's inside that mattered anyway." "Not literally," Dylan replied, wrapping his arms around Shadow's neck. "Whatever you say," Shadow replied, chuckling and shaking his head. With that he took off, running on all fours, into the night. Miller was dead, and there were only a few scientists left working in the labs. A fresh blood sample had been taken from 00001, and from there the scientists working on version 2 began adding on to that base. The scientists, loyal to the true Patriots, took what Ian had finished of the project and everything else needed for the current projects, and then haphazardly rushed through the last unfinished steps of the process of creating and growing the made hybrid the bulk of their work was focused on. Exactly what Ian had said should never have been done when creating a new animal. The new baby didn't have an egg, just a synthetic version, a small, slimy, clear-hanging bag made of biomatter with a large biohazard symbol printed on the side. Finally, the moment came, and a claw sliced it open. When it did, a large amount of mostly clear liquid began pouring from the gash as the new hybrid began clawing its way free from the bag that had served as its egg. It looked almost exactly like 000001, except for the lack of a Spinosaurus sail. Instead, a row of spikes that looked more like growths were emerging along the Dunkleosteus armor-covered back. It was also a bit bulkier than its predecessor, and perfectly capable of walking either on all fours or just on two legs. It had the teeth of the scissor-toothed shark Adestus, giving the new hybrid a truly terrifying look to it. The teeth ran in a single row along the center of the top and bottom of the dinosaur's mouth. Just like version 1, however, the teeth were made special and able to break through the armor that covered the hybrid's bodies, though most bullets couldn't. The claws were the same way. Its eyes were, when compared to version 1, the same size relatively to its skull as its predecessors, but they glowed with a bioluminescent deep yellow color instead of green. And like with version 1, there were no visible pupils to be seen. However, there was a difference between them. Unlike version 1, version 2 had thermal vision. Like version 1, there was also a series of quills growing out of the back of its armored head, though the ones on this version looked more like spikes than quills. On its feet were the killing sickle claws of the Utah raptor, and between each toe was webbing for improved swimming capabilities, and this hybrid even had gills on its neck, allowing it to be just as dangerous in the water as it was on land. Version 2 also had Stegosaurus spikes, Thagomisers, on its tail, but it had an additional third row instead of version 1's 2 rows. Version 2 was stronger, faster, and thanks to an extremely accelerated growth rate, would be fully grown and matured in just over a week, 8 or 9 days in total. But, thanks to the truly brilliant scientists who created the hybrid, he was designed so that the accelerated aging would stop as soon as he was fully matured, which meant he wouldn't age so fast that he died in a month. He could now be used as a long-term weapon for the true patriots. Once version 2 was fully grown, he would be unleashed upon the united communities. A truly perfect monster, deadly on land and in the water. The first step for the true patriots to take back what they had lost in the war 10 years before was completed at last. Despite the setbacks and many key members being killed, they could still pull off re-establishing the Patriots as the leading force in their area of the world once more. Their plans of taking over every community in their area were not too different from how Imperial Japan had taken over several countries prior to World War II. And version 2 was already providing promising results. When one of the scientists reached towards him, the little hybrid lunged forward and sunk his unique fangs into the man's finger. Blood dripping from his mouth, the surprisingly aggressive hybrid skittered back, growling threateningly. "Magnificent," the scientist said, examining his bleeding finger. "Less than 2 minutes old, and it's already drawn first blood." With version 1, the true patriots had tried to use pain and fear to force it, and its now deceased sibling, into submission. But that approach had failed, and only resulted in a dinosaur that refused to give them what they wanted. With version 2, they would take a different approach. Brainwashing that would start immediately. They would program its impressionable, instinct-driven mind into something of their image before a proper personality could take root to resist them. They would raise it to suppress its own free will, lock away whatever personality it might have grown to have, and just become a programmed creature that was loyal to them and thought it only wanted one thing in life: to spill blood. To be continued. The Hybrid, Part 2, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus, read by the author. To see what happens next with Dylan and Shadow now that they're on the run from both the Patriots and the True Patriots, and what the people who created Shadow and version 2 will do next now that their secret is out, be sure to stick around for the release of the book itself to see how this story ends. With Dylan and Shadow now on the run and being hunted, they will be finding themselves in much more danger than they can ever guess. Keep in mind as well that, like with the Survivor's Daily Routine series, I restructured certain parts of this to avoid giving away too many answers from the book. The book version will read differently in some areas than how this did. More scenes are present or occur differently, and I actually rewrote one scene specifically for this version to avoid certain spoilers to the bigger narrative as a whole. I took a few creative liberties with the audio version. I've done that with several of the others before, so just remember that, and thank you for listening, and please, if you're at all curious, be sure to stick around for the release of the Spinosaurus, my original novel, which hopefully will be coming out soon. Very exciting, very exciting. I've wanted to be an author my whole life, and it's really starting to get real now, so once again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. The next video will be The Monster, the final installment of the Survivor's Daily Routine story, so I hope to see you for that one.